Hey everybody, it's Mr. Marvin. In this video I'm going to give you some quick, possibly, thoughts about this week's readings, which were Michael Pollan's article, Escape from the Western Diet, and Mary Maxfield's response to that article, Food as Thought, Resisting the Moralization of Eating. So I had heard of Michael Pollan before, just, in my travels as a person who thinks about books and stuff, but I had never actually read any of his stuff, and this is the first semester that I actually assigned any of his writing. And I was surprised at how emphatically my on-campus students responded to this article. Apparently you guys care a lot about food, which I thought was really cool. As for the article itself, I thought it was very interesting and very complex, despite only being, 5 or 6 pages. At least I found I had to really slow down and read this article carefully to really wrap my brain around what he's talking about. And even as somebody who thinks about, what kind of food I put in my body on a daily basis, constantly thinking about that sort of thing, I still found his article to be really illuminating, and I found myself kind of well disposed to him as a writer, which is not as much as I can say for Mary Maxfield's response, but maybe we'll get into that in a few minutes. Just a few things to point out for me that I thought were particularly interesting is how he really establishes a strong sense of they say in the beginning of this article. So we should clarify that this is a excerpt, right, from In Defense of Food, his 2008 book, An Eater's Manifesto. So we're just getting a few pages of what I assume is probably the introduction to that book. So we don't have the context of his entire book that Mary Maxfield probably has, to her credit, to be fair, right, to her criticism. But nevertheless, right, even in just this little blurb that we have, this little excerpt that we have, I think he does a strong job of establishing what they say about the Western diet in these first couple of paragraphs, particularly with regard to nutritionism, which, if you took the time to look that up, as I had to do, that means the belief that nutrients determine the value of food, right? And he kind of uses that as a springboard to getting into our current attitudes about food and how we're kind of really looking for the one answer, right? On 625, he says it's only natural for scientists, no less than the rest of us, to gravitate toward a single, all-encompassing explanation, right? We really kind of just want the definitive answer about how to eat. And like with so many things in life, and so many things that are worth writing about in, say, an English class, there very often isn't one right answer, because if there is one right answer, if there was one right answer, we probably would have found it already, and we all would be following that. But there's a nice transition to his own voice, his I say, on the bottom of 625, when he says, because it turns out we don't need to declare our allegiance to any of these schools of thought in order to figure out how best to eat. And so there's a nice sort of example of the titular they say, I say dichotomy there just in the beginning. What else does he talk about? One thing that kind of blew my mind in particular was his stuff on 626 about how, trying to figure out the why, right, the scientific explanations behind what makes a food healthy or not. He kind of argues that it isn't really useful to us normal people, whereas it is more useful to entities like the food industry or the medical community, because the food industry would benefit from knowing what they need to do, having a scientific rationale for further processing foods, he said, in order to sort of make them more addictive or make them appear more healthy. If a study comes out and says that, fewer carbohydrates are better, then, a food industry or a food company or whatever can say that these cookies are low carb, and that, that'll kind of manipulate people into thinking that those cookies are healthier than normal cookies. And the medical community also kind of along those similar lines, right? The healthcare industry, being an industry, stands to profit more handsomely from new drugs and procedures to treat chronic diseases than it does from a wholesale change in the way people eat, right? And he kind of acknowledges that might be a cynical way of looking at things, but I think there's a lot of truth to it. We don't really see the machinations behind these big entities, right? When we grocery shop, we just kind of look at what's on the shelf, and maybe we look at the label, right? Some of us look at the labels, but we don't really think about what's really motivating the companies that are behind these things. How much do they actually have our best interest in mind? and even the medical community. I tend to myself. I know a lot of people, don't really like doctors and don't really trust their doctors and or doctors in general. But I've always had good relationships with my medical people. But the healthcare industry, it is an industry, right? As he says, and they are kind of concerned with the perpetuation, right, of their industry. So, if everybody was super healthy, I guess theoretically that would be bad for for the health industry. But kind of mind-bendy stuff there. One of his phrases that I particularly like is this notion of the treacherous food environment that he talks about on 627, which is something that I think about all the time, just in terms of how insidious unhealthy food is. And no matter what your definition of unhealthy food is, it's just everywhere and so easy to get and so inexpensive compared to the healthy stuff and so difficult to resist. It's just it's just all over the place, right? And you really have to be vigilant. It's way more work, just like in the same way that it's more work to go to the gym, right? To work out and be healthy. It's easier to just not go to the gym, right? And just be lazy. So in the same way, it's a lot easier to just eat whatever you want and, junk food be damned, who cares? It is easier, right, to sort of live that lifestyle. It's hard to say no to cake in the break room, or to say no to having cupcakes because it's so-and-so's birthday at the office, or or to say no to dessert, or to say no to certain preparations of food or whatever. It's a lot of work, and it takes a lot of, again, vigilance to kind of stick to that. So treacherous was a good way of describing our food environment to me, because you only have to drive a couple miles down the highway before you see an ad for McDonald's, and McDonald's is delicious. Right? I'll be the first to admit, even though I think it's probably closer to poison than it is food. Another thing that jumped out to me here is that the challenge that we face today in figuring out how to escape the worst elements of the Western diet and lifestyle without going back to the bush. This is in response to this Dennis Burkitt idea about how the only way we're going to reduce disease is to go backwards to the diet and lifestyle of our ancestors. It's on 627. And that speaks to me a lot because personally, I'm not trying to evangelize this or anything, but personally, I follow a primal paleo sort of lifestyle, and I have done so for many years at this point. I think since I was in graduate school. So that's got to be close to 10 years, coming up on 10 years. It really works for me. I really like it, but it kind of always gets that sort of snarky criticism of, cavemen didn't live that long, and, why would you want to eat like that, and, it's not something I'll go into, but it's, I don't know. I like the idea of trying to benefit from, or trying to learn from, the simpler times without obviously going back to having to build your own fire and run away from saber-toothed tigers and all that sort of thing. So that was cool. Anyway, I don't want the video to go on for too long, so let me just talk about his 3 rules at the end here. His notion of, I don't think I need to say anything about this. The Western diet is fast, cheap, and easy. Right? Yeah, that's what I said before. So his 3 rules, right? And this is kind of one of the things that Maxfield really has some contention with. He proposes 3 rules, right, or what he calls these algorithms. Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. And again, this obviously is coming from the intro of his book, and those rules are obviously super vague, right? Eat food, what does that even mean, right? Anything is food if you're hungry enough, right? Not too much. It's very unscientific, very unspecific. Mostly plants, okay, right? Kind of very vague, but I think intentionally vague, right? Intentionally simplistic, or intentionally very overarching sort of principles, and I think that's why he treats them as algorithms. But they make sense to me. Rather than, I think his real purpose is trying to advise us to, rather than get bogged down in the weeds and all the whys and the calorie counting and the what is the one right way to eat, right? The one diet that's not going to kill us, or that's going to help us prolong death for as long as possible. I think he's really encouraging us to not stress out about all that, so much and just kind of come back to these basic principles of eat food. All right, and what is the definition of food? That could vary from person to person. Presumably, he goes into his definition of what food is. Probably not cheese doodles, unfortunately, but not too much. Right, kind of coming back to that American overeating problem, and then mostly plants, which I think is kind of hard to disagree with. You can have an argument about whether or not, you know, eating meat or being vegan is better, right? And it's probably, again, there's no one right answer for that, I don't think. I think it's whatever works for you and whatever makes you feel great all the time. But yeah, I mean, his rules really work for me. And I think that's one of the reasons why I'm surprised at Maxfield's criticism of Pollan's ideas and how she seems to be so offended by his position. Because personally, I find him fairly likable, right, as a writer, and fairly reasonable and not super evangelical in terms of saying eat this, don't eat this, giving a lot of prescriptive rules. And one of her criticisms is that he is contributing to this anxiety around the culture of eating. Let's see. She says, does he contribute to our cultural anxiety over food? Right. And she kind of accuses him, I'm not sure how directly, but she kind of accuses him of a certain degree of hypocrisy in that he is saying, don't worry about all these specific rules or specific nutritionism or whatever. And yet he does give his own rules, right? So she seems to be suggesting that his rules are different, right? But, don't stress out about everybody else's rules, but you should follow my rules. And I don't think that's really a fair characterization of his argument. Again, I think he's trying to help us navigate this sort of just the infinitely complex morass of dietary advice, right? And again, just like anything else, you can find, if you want to find evidence that you should eat only meat, you can probably find articles that say that that's a good idea. And if you think that veganism is the right way to go, you can find no shortage of articles saying that veganism is the best way to go. And so I think he's really trying to encourage us to sort of rise above all that. And while he does give his own rules, right, his own sort of school of thought, I think it's in service of rising above all of the individual, camps, all of the sort of the different dietary tribes, so to speak. So that part of her argument doesn't really jive with me so much. I also kind of was surprised at, and again, to be fair to Maxfield, we don't have the context of Pollan's entire book, right? Presumably she's read his entire book, and if not more than one of his books. And so we're only getting his introduction to the Eater's Manifesto, but she seems to be critical of how he talks about body types, and obviously in the section that we read, I don't think he mentions body type at all, right? So it's kind of hard for us to judge how fair she's being in her criticism, how fairly and accurately she is portraying his position. But she seems to be, I don't know much about her as an author, but she seems to be kind of concerned with these notions of that diet and weight and health are not inextricably connected, which for me, as somebody who kind of believes in the notion that, food is your medicine, right? And your medicine is food. Whoever said that, Hippocrates, I think. I find it kind of hard to believe that diet doesn't play a major role, right? If not the most major role in our health and in our weight. It's not to say there certainly aren't conditions, that are beyond people's control. But I find it hard to believe that the diet doesn't play a big role in that, because again, some people, I have friends who like to joke that they work out specifically so that they can eat cake and so they can eat cheeseburgers and stuff. And I love those things as much as the next guy. But, diet doesn't really you can't outrun. They say you can't outrun, right, a bad diet, right? Because it takes you, what, 15 minutes to eat a cheeseburger. That's like, from McDonald's, that's like 1,500 calories. To burn 1,500 calories, you would have to run for like, what, 10 miles or something, right, or more. So obviously that's not sustainable. So it's a lot easier to, I think it's a lot easier to eat well, right, and exercise in a way that's enjoyable rather than having to do CrossFit, 5 or 6 days a week so that you can eat donuts every morning for breakfast. I don't know. But let's see, what else? Yeah, I mean, she talks about that pollen conflates health with weight and condemns fatness out of hand. So, which made me sort of ask, is it possible to be fat and healthy? Right? I don't mean to say fat in a derogatory way. That's a word that she uses. But is it possible to be overweight and be healthy? I don't know. I mean, I suppose it is, but I would imagine in those two options, I would imagine that being less overweight is probably better most of the time. Not, but I mean, I'm not a nutritionist or a physical therapist or anything, or a medical doctor, so don't take my advice. But she sort of seems to be a little concerned with things that don't quite make sense to me in the same way that Pollan's thinking does. I guess I'll just wrap up by looking at her rules. So she kind of offers her 3 alternatives, and I think it's useful to kind of contrast Pollan's eat food, not too much, mostly plants, with Maxfield's concluding rules, which are trust yourself, trust your body, meet your needs. And even though Pollan's rules, like we said, are kind of intentionally vague and simplistic, I think they're more actionable for me. They're more actionable than these rules from Maxfield, like trust yourself, trust your body, meet your needs. I mean, I wrote in my margin, what does that mean? Trust yourself. I mean, okay, I guess is that just an excuse to say, like, what my body really needs right now is cupcakes. I really feel like I need cupcakes. I don't know. I mean, I suppose you could sort of be that kind of snarky interpretation of Pollan's thing if you say, like, eat food. Well, I think cupcakes are food, so take that, Michael Pollan, right? But, but her whole trust yourself, trust your body, meet your needs thing, I don't know. I just feel like diet and health. I agree that there's not one right way or one right answer to these things, but at the same time, I do feel like the science can't be completely ignored, I guess. And, there are some things that are definitely not healthy. And, it's nice to think that, overweight can be healthy just as much as thin or skinny can be healthy or whatever. And maybe that's true. I don't know. But at the same time, I don't think it's not my style to completely ignore the facts, because I do think there are facts out there. It's just a matter of choosing to think critically about them and then try on those facts and see whether they're things you want to adapt in your own life, I guess. Anyway, that was probably a little bit rambly, so I apologize. But those are my thoughts on the articles. Again, I found them very interesting, and I was surprised at how invested students were in talking about food. So I hope you guys felt the same way. These 2 articles obviously come on the cusp of our synthesis essay, the video for which will be going up very shortly, if it hasn't already by the time I post this. The past couple of weeks, we did Nicholas Carr and Clive Thompson, right, we did 2 different discussion boards on 2 different articles about technology. This week, we did 1 discussion board about 2 articles. In both instances, you have authors that are directly referencing one another. I should say Carr himself, cites a lot of different people, including Clive Thompson, and Clive Thompson cites a lot of different people, including Nicholas Carr, of course, himself. Pollan cites a lot of different sources, and Maxfield obviously directly responds to Pollan in addition to bringing in her own sources. So I think this set of articles is a really good body of research, so to speak, to sort of set us up for the synthesis essay, because it's really clear how to see how these authors are engaging in conversation with each other. And that's, as we said before, that's what the whole course is about, really, but that's really what you're going to be expected to do in your synthesis essay, is sort of explain the conversation that your 2 authors, your 2 articles are having, and then allow yourself to participate in that conversation and add your own 2 cents about whatever the topic is at hand. So That should set us up pretty nicely for the synthesis essay. If you have any thoughts about anything I said in this video or anything I did not say in the video, feel free to reply down below. But otherwise, I hope you guys are having a good start to your spring. Pretty soon it's going to be April, and everything's moving along. So I will see you guys online.